In 1985, the American Midwest was a graveyard of bankrupt farms. While his neighbors packed their bags, one desperate farmer bet his family's century-old legacy on a rusted, untested machine built by a rogue engineer. They called him Crazy. Today he owns the entire county. Here is his story. The wind howling across Gage County, Nebraska, in the spring of 1985 didn't just carry dirt. It carried the bitter scent of failure. It was the height of the 1980s farm crisis, a brutal economic meat grinder triggered by the Federal Reserve's sky-high interest rates and a global grain embargo that had slashed crop prices to the bone. Across the Midwest, century-old family farms were being dismantled at public auctions, sold off to the highest bidder, while grown men stood in the crowd weeping openly as their grandfathers' tractors were driven away by strangers. Arthur Pendleton was 42 years old, but the deep, cracked lines around his eyes made him look closer to 60. He sat in the cab of his idling 1974 Ford F-150, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Through the cracked windshield, he watched the auctioneer's gavel fall on the Henderson place. Calvin Henderson, Arthur's closest neighbor and a man who had taught him how to drive a combine 20 years ago, was losing all 900 acres. Standing near the front of the auction crowd, completely impervious to the blowing dust in his immaculate beige trench coat and unscuffed leather boots, was Harlan Montgomery. Harlan was a third-generation heir to a Chicago-based agribusiness conglomerate. While men like Arthur bled out, slowly paying 18% interest on their operating loans, Harlan's firm was flush with corporate cash. They were swooping into Gage County like vultures buying up prime agricultural land for pennies on the dollar. When the auctioneer shouted, "Sold," Harlan didn't even smile. He simply nodded to his lawyer, turned on his heel, and walked to his idling Lincoln Town car. Harlan Montgomery already owned 30% of the arable land in the county. He made no secret of the fact that he wanted it all. And Arthur's sprawling 1,200-acre ranch, sitting directly adjacent to Harlan's new megafarm, was next on the menu. Arthur put the truck in gear and drove slowly back to his own property. The Pendleton Ranch had survived the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and 2 world wars. But it was not going to survive 1985. His debt at the First National Bank of Omaha had ballooned to $300,000. The traditional farming methods, deep plowing the soil to turn over the earth before planting, were destroying him. Every time Arthur ran his heavy steel plows through the dirt, it required thousands of gallons of expensive diesel fuel. Worse, turning the soil exposed the vital subsurface moisture to the brutal Nebraska sun, drying it out. The high winds would then strip the topsoil away. It was a vicious cycle of spending borrowed money to slowly destroy his own land. When Arthur walked into the farmhouse kitchen, his wife Clara was sitting at the worn oak table. She was reviewing a stack of past due notices from the seed cooperative and the local John Deere dealership. Clara was a resilient woman, the backbone of the Pendleton operation, but the exhaustion was evident in the heavy slump of her shoulders. "Calvin lost the farm," Arthur said, quietly, hanging his sweat-stained Stetson on the wall peg. Clara closed her eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. "Where will they go?" "His brother has a spare room in Omaha. He's going to look for warehouse work." Arthur walked to the sink and scrubbed his grease-stained hands. The water ran black. Harlan Montgomery bought it, paid $400 an acre. It's worth triple that. Clara looked up, her expression tightening. "Dale Peterson from the bank called while you were out. He said the loan committee met yesterday. They aren't going to extend our operating line of credit for the spring planting season, Arthur. Unless we can come up with $80,000 in cash to pay down the principal, they're going to initiate foreclosure by September." The kitchen fell dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, a wedding gift from Arthur's grandfather. $80,000 might as well have been $8 million. Their tractors were already mortgaged. The land was leveraged to the hilt. The only asset they had left free and clear was the original 60 acres surrounding the farmhouse, legally separated from the commercial farm operation years ago, to protect the family home. "If we don't plant, we default," Arthur muttered, staring out the window at the rolling brown fields that had belonged to a Pendleton for over 100 years. "If we plant the old way, we'll burn through fuel we can't afford, and a dry summer will wipe out the yield anyway. We need a miracle, Clara. Or we need to pack our bags." "There has to be another way," Clara whispered, stepping up behind him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "We don't know anything else, Arthur. This dirt is in our blood." Arthur looked out toward the property line, where a massive, shiny new tractor belonging to Harlan Montgomery was already tearing into Calvin Henderson's former fields. A dark, reckless resolve began to form in Arthur's chest. He was not going to give Harlan Montgomery the satisfaction of buying his grandfather's land at a discount. If he was going to go down, he was going to go down swinging. "I'm driving to Des Moines tomorrow," Arthur said, his voice hardening into steel. "The Iowa Power Farming Show is this weekend. There are thousands of dealers there. Somebody somewhere has to have an answer." The Iowa Power Farming Show in Des Moines was a sprawling, deafening spectacle of agricultural machinery. Under the massive, cavernous roofs of the exhibition halls, the giants of the industry, Case IH John Deere, Massey Ferguson, displayed their newest, most expensive toys. Gleaming green and red tractors with enclosed air-conditioned cabs and massive horsepower ratings sat under bright stadium lights. Salesmen in crisp polo shirts handed out glossy brochures promising higher yields to farmers who could afford the staggering $250,000 price tags. Arthur walked through the aisles feeling like a ghost. He had $300 in his checking account. The towering machines around him felt like insults, monuments to an industry that was rapidly leaving the independent family farmer behind. He spent 6 hours wandering the main halls, finding nothing but debt traps and variations of the same massive ploughing equipment that was currently bleeding him dry. Defeated Arthur wandered toward the outermost perimeter of the fairgrounds, a dusty, poorly lit annex where independent tinkerers, small-time manufacturers, and fringe inventors rented cheap booth space. It was mostly junk snake oil soil additives, flimsy aftermarket parts, and poorly welded attachments. But at the very back of the annex, beneath a sagging canvas tent, sat a machine that stopped Arthur in his tracks. It didn't look like anything he had ever seen. It lacked the massive steel disc blades of a traditional plough. Instead, it was a wide, heavy-duty toolbar equipped with a complex series of pneumatic tubes, heavy hydraulic downward pressure springs, and razor-thin, jagged cutting discs. It was painted a dull, flat grey, completely devoid of corporate branding. Standing next to it was a tall, incredibly thin man with wild, greying hair, wearing oil-stained coveralls. He was arguing intensely with a passing farmer, who waved him off dismissively. Arthur approached the machine, running his hand over the heavy steel frame. The welding was crude, but incredibly strong. "It's not for ploughing," a gravelly voice said. Arthur turned to see the thin man watching him with piercing blue eyes. "If you're looking to rip your soil to shreds and watch it blow into the next county, go buy a Deere. If you want to survive the decade, you look at this." "Who are you?" Arthur asked. "Thomas Fisk," the man replied, extending a grimy hand. "Former senior agricultural engineer at a major manufacturer I won't name until they fired me for telling the board of directors that their ploughing methods were chemically and structurally bankrupting the American Midwest. This is the Fisk X900 direct drill. It is a pneumatic, no-till planter. No-till? Arthur frowned. The concept was not entirely unheard of, but in 1985 it was considered academic heresy. The fundamental rule of farming for 10,000 years was that you had to plough the earth to prepare a soft seedbed. "Ploughing is suicide," Fisk said, passionately tapping the steel frame of his machine with a wrench. "Every time till you destroy the microscopic fungal networks in the soil. You release the trapped moisture. You burn 40 gallons of diesel an hour, pulling iron through the dirt. The X900 changes all of that. It uses aggressive hydraulic downward pressure. Those razor discs slice a slit into the hard, unploughed earth, right through the dead stalks of last year's crop. The pneumatic tubes shoot the seed directly into the slit, and these cast-iron closing wheels instantly pack the dirt back down. You only drive over the field once. You save 80% on fuel. You preserve your topsoil. And the dead plant matter on the surface acts as a thermal blanket, trapping the moisture underneath." Arthur stared at the machine. It sounded like magic. It also sounded insane. "Has it been tested?" Fisk hesitated his bravado, slipping for a fraction of a second. "I've run field trials on 10 acres. The yield was outstanding. 10 acres I farm 1,200, Arthur said, shaking his head. "If this thing jams or if the seeds don't take in the hard dirt, I won't just have a bad harvest. I'll lose my family's legacy. Why isn't anyone else buying it? Because farmers are stubborn." Fisk spat his eyes, burning with a desperate intensity. "They farm the way their daddies farmed, and they'll go bankrupt doing it. The corporate farms don't want it, because they can afford the fuel and the water to brute force the land. This machine is for the independent guy. I sunk my life savings, my pension, and my house into building this prototype. It's the only one in existence." Arthur looked closely at the hydraulic lines, the heavy-duty air compressor, mounted to the frame, the raw, brutal efficiency of the design. It was a massive risk, but it was also exactly what he needed, a way to plant a massive crop with almost zero fuel costs, preserving whatever moisture was left in the drought-stricken Nebraska soil. "How much?" Arthur asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. $65,000, Fisk said, quietly. "Cash." Arthur felt the breath leave his lungs. $65,000. It was an astronomical sum for a broke farmer, but it was also exactly the appraised equity value of his family's farmhouse and the remaining 60 acres, the one thing he had sworn to Clara he would never touch, the one asset the bank hadn't swallowed yet. Arthur stood in silence for 5 full minutes. He pictured Harlan Montgomery's smug face. He pictured the bank foreclosing on the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. He pictured becoming a tenant farmer on his own dirt. "Do you have a contract?" Arthur asked. Fisk's eyes widened in shock. "You're serious?" "I'll be back in 2 days with a cashier's check," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly, but his eyes fixed in an iron stare. "But if this machine fails, Fisk, I'm taking you down with me." The drive back to Gage County was the longest of Arthur's life. When he finally walked into the house, Clara was making coffee. He sat her down at the table and laid out the brochures Fisk had hastily scribbled technical specs onto. He told her about the second mortgage. He told her he had risked the house. Clara stared at him, her face draining of color. "You mortgaged the house, Arthur, for an experimental machine built by a fired engineer. A machine that has never planted a commercial crop. Clara, listen to me," Arthur pleaded, gripping her hands. "If we do what we've always done, we are guaranteed to fail. The bank is going to take the fields anyway. Harlan Montgomery is just waiting for us to bleed out. This no-till drill, it cuts our diesel bill by 80%. We can plant the entire acreage in half the time. It's our only shot to survive the season." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she didn't pull her hands away. She looked around the kitchen at the fading wallpaper, the worn linoleum floor, the history of their life together. She knew Arthur was a desperate man, but she also knew he was a brilliant farmer. "If this doesn't work, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, "we will be homeless. We won't just lose the business. We will lose the roof over our heads." "I know," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "I know." The Fisk X900 arrived on a flatbed trailer 2 weeks later, right as the critical spring planting window opened. As Arthur and Thomas Fisk, who had insisted on coming down to Gage County to help calibrate the prototype, unloaded the massive grey steel beastword, quickly spread around the county. Within hours, pickup trucks began to slow down as they passed the Pendleton property line. Farmers leaned out of their windows, pointing and laughing at the bizarre contraption. In the farming community, planting directly into last year's crop residue, what they called farming in the trash was considered the ultimate sign of laziness and sheer stupidity. The most vocal critic was Harlan Montgomery. Harlan parked his Lincoln by the fence line, flanked by his foreman, a hulking man named Miller. Harlan walked up to the barbed wire, a condescending smirk plastered across his face. "Pendleton," Harlan called out over the roar of Arthur's tractor engine. "I heard you lost your mind, but I didn't think you'd broadcast it to the whole county. You can't plant seeds into hard-pan dirt, or you're throwing away your seed money. Tell you what, I'll offer you 200 an acre for the land right now. Save you the embarrassment of a total crop failure." Arthur ignored him, gripping the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He engaged the power takeoff, and the X900's pneumatic blowers roared to life. He dropped the heavy toolbar into the dirt. The first day was an absolute nightmare. The hydraulic downward pressure was incredibly difficult to balance. In one pass, the razor discs barely scratched the hard earth, leaving expensive seed scattered uselessly on the surface for the crows to eat. On the next pass, the discs dug too deep, burying the seed so far down it would never germinate. At 3 a.m., working under the glaring halogen floodlights of the tractor, a primary hydraulic manifold blew spraying hot pressurized fluid across the windshield. Arthur screamed in frustration, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. Thomas Fisk, covered in grease and looking like a panicked ghost, spent the next 14 hours desperately re-welding the manifold in Arthur's barn, while Arthur paced the floor, calculating the rapidly closing planting window. By day 3, however, they found the sweet spot. The machine began to hum. It was a brutal, violent process, the heavy steel discs slicing through the dried stalks of last year's corn, the pneumatic tubes spitting seed with machine gun precision, and the heavy cast-iron wheels slamming the earth shut behind it. Because they weren't dragging plows deep through the earth, Arthur was able to drive the tractor at almost twice the normal speed. They planted all 1,200 acres in record time, burning a fraction of the diesel Arthur had budgeted for. But the victory was short-lived. On the morning Arthur was scheduled to plant the final 80-acre parcel, bordering Harlan Montgomery's land, he walked out to the tractor to find a pool of hydraulic fluid bleeding into the dirt. Arthur's blood ran cold. He scrambled under the machine. 3 of the main reinforced rubber hydraulic lines had been cleanly severed. This wasn't a blowout. This was a deliberate cut with a heavy-duty blade. Clara ran out of the house, clutching her robe, her eyes wide, as she saw Arthur kneeling in the toxic red puddle. "What happened?" "Somebody cut the lines," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal calm. He looked up, scanning the dirt near the barn. He found the unmistakable tread marks of a heavy, dual-wheeled pickup truck, the exact kind driven by Harlan's foreman. "Arthur, call the sheriff," Clara pleaded. "The sheriff is drinking buddies with Harlan Montgomery." Arthur snapped, wiping the oil from his hands. He'd look at this call it farm vandalism and file a report that'll gather dust for 10 years. Harlan knows my margins are razor thin. He knows if I miss this planting window, I default. He's trying to bleed me out. Arthur didn't call the police. Instead, he drove to the local Napa Auto Parts store in Wymore, maxed out his final credit card to buy replacement industrial hoses, and spent 24 straight hours replumbing the entire machine by flashlight, keeping a loaded 12-gauge shotgun resting against the tractor tire just in case Harlan's men decided to come back. By dawn the next day, the final acres were planted. Now all Arthur could do was wait. June arrived, and with it came the true test. The summer of 1985 went down in Midwestern history as a devastating drought. For 42 consecutive days, not a single drop of rain fell on Gage County. The sky was a relentless, punishing dome of blue, and the temperature hovered near 100 degrees. Across the county, the consequences of traditional plowing began to manifest in catastrophic fashion. Because farmers like Harlan Montgomery had deeply tilled their soil, breaking up the earth to make it soft, the relentless sun baked the moisture right out of the dirt. The soil turned into a fine, powdery ash. The high winds returned, sweeping the precious topsoil into massive, choking dust clouds. Harlan's impeccably planted fields of corn withered, turned yellow, and stunted the exposed earth, cracking like shattered glass. Arthur stood on his porch with Clara, watching the dust storms rage across Harlan's mega farm. Then he walked out into his own fields. The ground was covered in the dead golden stalks of the previous year's harvest, looking messy and unkempt. But as Arthur knelt down and brushed the protective layer of trash aside, he dug his fingers into the slit made by the X900. Beneath the dead residue, the earth was cool, and it was damp. The unplowed soil had retained its microscopic capillary structure. The dead stalks on the surface had acted like a giant thermal shield, blocking the sun from baking the moisture away and preventing the wind from stealing the topsoil. And pushing up through the narrow slits in the earth in perfectly straight aggressive rows were the vibrant, dark green shoots of a massive, thriving corn crop. Arthur fell to his knees in the dirt, clutching a handful of the damp soil tears, cutting tracks through the dust on his face. The Fisk X900 hadn't just worked, it had orchestrated a biological miracle. But Harlan Montgomery was not a man who took defeat lightly, and when he realized that the bankrupt farmer next door was sitting on the only surviving green crop in the county, Harlan's corporate greed mutated into outright destructive warfare. If Harlan couldn't buy the Pendleton ranch, he was going to make sure it burned to the ground. The heat of late July pressed down on Gage County like a suffocating blanket. The historic drought had shown no mercy, and the tension in the farming community had reached a boiling point. Harlan Montgomery was a man accustomed to winning through brute financial force. Watching his massive, heavily leveraged corporate crop wither into useless brown husks, while Arthur Pendleton's fields transformed into a sprawling ocean of vibrant green corn, drove Harlan to a state of unhinged desperation. His Chicago investors were demanding answers, and the bank was threatening to freeze his credit lines. Harlan needed Arthur to fail. It happened on a moonless Tuesday night. Arthur and Clara were asleep in the farmhouse, the windows wide open to catch whatever miserable breeze the prairie could offer. At 2 a.m, the harsh, unmistakable scent of burning diesel fuel and roasting corn leaves drifted into their bedroom. Arthur woke with a violent jolt. He sprinted to the window, his bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. Out in the distance, illuminating the pitch-black horizon with a terrifying, sickly orange glow, a wall of flames was rapidly devouring his eastern 50-acre parcel. Arthur did not bother getting dressed. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his shotgun, and raced down the stairs. Clara was already on the kitchen telephone, frantically cranking the dial to alert the volunteer fire department in town. By the time Arthur reached his tractor, the fire had grown into a monstrous, roaring beast, fueled by the bone-dry winds sweeping across the plains. He fired up his massive John Deere and attached the heavy disc ripper, the very tool he had sworn never to use again. He needed to cut a fire break, and he needed to do it immediately, or the blaze would consume the entire 1,200 acres, and eventually the house. Driving like a madman, Arthur barreled toward the inferno. The heat was unbearable, blistering the paint on the tractor's hood and cracking the glass of the cab. He dropped the heavy steel discs deeply into the earth, tearing up his own beautiful, healthy corn, destroying his own crop to save the rest of the farm. He dragged the iron through the dirt, creating a wide, barren trench of turned soil that the fire could not jump. Behind him, the siren of a solitary fire truck wailed in the distance, but they were miles away. Arthur fought the flames alone in the dark, his eyes stinging with thick black smoke, praying the wind would not shift. When the dawn finally broke over the Nebraska horizon, the eastern parcel was nothing but a smoldering, blackened scar. 50 acres of prime corn had been reduced to ash. Arthur sat exhausted on the front tire of his tractor, his face covered in soot and sweat. Sheriff Brody pulled up in his cruiser, stepping out slowly, surveying the damage with a grim expression. He held up a melted red plastic jerry can he had found near the county road. It was a crude, obvious act of arson. "I know exactly who did this." "Brody," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Harlan Montgomery's men. They parked on the gravel road and tossed a match." "Now, Arthur, we do not have any concrete proof of that," Sheriff Brody replied, shifting uncomfortably and looking away. "It is entirely possible that a passing trucker threw a lit cigarette out the window. It is terribly dry out here." Arthur stood up, grabbing his shotgun from the tractor cab. "You tell Harlan Montgomery that if I ever see his truck near my property line again, I am not calling you. I am going to bury him under the dirt he is trying to steal." The fire was a devastating blow, representing a loss of roughly $30,000 in projected revenue, but the fire break had held. The remaining 1,150 acres were completely untouched, their green stalks reaching high into the sky, drawing critical moisture from the protected, unplowed earth below. The Fisk machine had given the plants root systems so deep they were drinking from the water table itself. But the sabotage had an unintended consequence. The massive plume of smoke had drawn the attention of the regional agricultural press. A reporter from the Omaha World Herald drove down to investigate the fire and ended up discovering the absolute miracle of Arthur's surviving crop. Photographs of Arthur, standing in his lush, towering cornfields, directly adjacent to Harlan's dead, cracked and desolate wasteland, were splashed across the front page of the Sunday paper. The headline read, "The Lone Green Oasis. In a Dying County 1 Farmer's Desperate Gamble." Within 48 hours of the article's publication, Arthur's phone began to ring incessantly. Desperate farmers from Iowa, Kansas, and the Dakotas were calling, begging to know what chemical or seed variety he was using. When Arthur explained that it was not a chemical, but a radical new no-till machine built by a disgraced engineer named Thomas Fisk, the paradigm shifted completely. Thomas Fisk, who had been sleeping on a cot in a rented garage, suddenly found himself swamped with furious demand. He drove back down to the Pendleton ranch, throwing open the kitchen door with a wild, manic grin on his face. "They want the drill, Arthur," Fisk shouted, slamming a massive stack of telegraphs and written order requests onto the kitchen table. "Everybody wants the X900. I have orders for 40 machines, but I do not have the capital to build the manufacturing facility. I need a business partner. I need a man who knows the dirt, who proved the concept, and who is not afraid of the corporate big shots." Arthur looked at Clara, who simply nodded. The bank had tried to ruin them, the drought had tried to starve them, and Harlan Montgomery had tried to burn them alive. They had survived it all. Arthur shook Fisk's hand, cementing a partnership that would permanently alter the course of American agricultural history. October brought the harvest, and with it the absolute, undeniable vindication of Arthur Pendleton. The deep, throbbing roar of the combine harvester echoed across Gage County like a victory march as Arthur began to pull his crop from the fields. It was a sensory revelation. While the rest of the county was an ocean of brittle, dead brown stalks, the Pendleton Ranch was a thriving jungle of resilient green. The local grain elevator, which had been practically empty for weeks due to the widespread catastrophic crop failures across the state, had to hastily call in emergency commercial rail cars just to handle the sheer overwhelming volume of grain Arthur was bringing in. His yields were not just average for a drought year. They were utterly staggering by any metric. The rich, undisturbed topsoil had produced corn ears that were massive, dense, and heavy with perfectly formed golden kernels. When Arthur walked through the polished glass doors of the First National Bank of Omaha to deposit his final harvest check, he wore his dust-covered work boots right onto their immaculate carpet. Dale Peterson, the loan officer who had smugly threatened foreclosure just 6 months prior, practically choked on his morning coffee when he saw the numbers printed on the paper. Arthur did not just pay off the $80,000 principal requirement. He sat in the uncomfortable leather chair across from Dale's mahogany desk and methodically wrote out the checks to pay off the entirety of his operating loans. He completely cleared the terrifying second mortgage he had desperately taken out on the family farmhouse, permanently securing his home. When the math was finally done, Arthur left an incredibly massive 6-figure surplus sitting cleanly in his checking account. He had achieved the absolute impossible right under the noses of the executives who had written him off. Meanwhile, Harlan Montgomery's sprawling corporate empire was rapidly collapsing into dust. His aggressive strategy of heavily leveraging borrowed money to buy land at distressed prices had completely backfired when the historic drought annihilated his heavily plowed, unprotected crops. The massive shining steel grain silos on Harlan's megafarm sat completely empty, echoing hollowly in the autumn wind. He had no grain to sell, and therefore absolutely no revenue to service his staggering multi-million-dollar debt. The Chicago investors, furious at the catastrophic financial losses and the embarrassing public relations disaster caused by the Sunday newspaper article highlighting Harlan's failure right next to Arthur's massive success, ruthlessly pulled their funding. They cut the cord without a second thought. In late November, with the first bitter snow flurries sweeping across the plains, the inevitable finally happened. The bank foreclosed on Harlan Montgomery's entire operation. The public auction was held on a freezing Tuesday morning, ironically, on the exact same courthouse steps where Arthur had stood in silent despair, watching Calvin Henderson lose his family farm just a few months prior. Harlan was not wearing his immaculate beige trench coat this time. He stood shivering in the back of the crowd, his face pale and gaunt, his posture heavily slumped, watching his entire Midwestern corporate kingdom being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Arthur stood at the very front of the breathless crowd, wearing his same worn Stetson, his hands wrapped warmly around a steel thermos of black coffee. As the auctioneer stepped up to the podium, his breath pluming in the freezing air, he began to take bids on the first massive 5,000-acre parcel of prime agricultural land. The bidding was extremely slow. The farming community was entirely broke, and the regional banks were completely terrified of lending a single dime of new money. The auctioneer asked for an opening bid of $1 million. Absolute silence hung heavy over the courtyard. 500,000! Arthur called out his voice, cutting through the bitter wind like a razor blade. Harlan's head snapped up from the back of the crowd, his eyes filled with absolute venom shock and disbelief. The auctioneer hesitated, scanning the freezing faces of the corporate lawyers and local farmers, then begrudgingly accepted the bid. No one else spoke. No one else had the liquid cash or the ironclad collateral to challenge him. "Sold," the auctioneer yelled, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down hard against the podium. Over the next 3 grueling hours, Arthur methodically and ruthlessly bought up every single acre of land that Harlan Montgomery had previously stolen from the desperate local farmers. He bought Calvin Henderson's old farm. He bought the northern pastures. He bought the sprawling, heavily damaged southern fields. By the time the auction finally concluded, Arthur had spent heavily, but he now unconditionally controlled an incredibly massive contiguous block of over 12,000 acres of land. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in disbelief, Arthur walked slowly over to where Harlan was standing, near a frozen oak tree. Harlan glared at him, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his pride utterly shattered. "You think you won Pendleton?" Harlan spat bitterly, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you can manage 12,000 acres with that stupid experimental toy of yours? You are just a dirt farmer. You will be bankrupt within 3 years." "I do not just own the land, Harlan," Arthur said quietly, looking the defeated corporate raider directly in the eye with a gaze as cold as the November wind. "I own half the patent on the machine that is going to plant it. Thomas Fisk and I just finalized the paperwork on a massive manufacturing plant in Des Moines. Next spring, this entire county is going no-till. We are going to heal the soil you destroyed. Now get off my property." The years rolled by, turning into decades, and the legend of Arthur Pendleton only grew. The Fisk-Pendleton Agricultural Manufacturing Company became a massive multi-million-dollar titan in the farming equipment industry, directly forcing the major legacy corporations to completely abandon their destructive plows and desperately scramble to develop their own competing no-till technologies. Arthur did not just hoard the land he bought. In a move that stunned the local banks, he tracked down Calvin Henderson and the other displaced families. He leased massive portions of their ancestral land back to them with incredibly generous low-interest terms. His only strict, non-negotiable requirement was that they exclusively utilize regenerative, no-till farming practices using the Fisk-Pendleton drills. Gage County miraculously transformed from a dying, desolate dust bowl into the undisputed absolute crown jewel of Midwestern agriculture. The vital topsoil deepened the underground aquifers, slowly replenished, and the local economy boomed with unprecedented sustainable prosperity. By the time Arthur officially retired and handed the daily operations of the sprawling mega-ranch over to his grandson, he was universally recognized not just as a survivor, but as a legendary pioneer. He had risked absolutely everything, betting his entire family legacy on a single untested piece of iron and an unyielding belief in a better way. He had started the darkest year of his life with a suffocating mountain of debt and a rusted pickup truck. Through sheer unrelenting stubbornness, brilliant innovation, and a refusal to surrender to corporate bullies, he had completely reshaped the world around him. He did not just save his grandfather's farm. He had quietly, effectively, and permanently bought the entire county. Arthur Pendleton and his journey prove that the greatest risks often yield the most extraordinary rewards. From standing on the brink of absolute ruin to revolutionizing an entire farming industry, his story remains a powerful testament to sheer grit, bold innovation, and the unbreakable spirit of the American farmer. If you were deeply inspired by this gripping tale of survival and triumph against all odds, Please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories.